The Velthari had ruled galactic commerce for 3,000 years. They were tall beings with gray skin and 4 arms, and they measured everything in numbers. Every decision they made came down to profit and loss. Every choice was a calculation. They built the largest trading empire the galaxy had ever seen, and they did it by treating everything as a product to be bought or sold. The mining colony on Kethris 7 was one of their oldest operations. It sat on a rocky moon at the edge of explored space, pulling rare minerals from deep underground. 12,000 workers lived there. Some were Velthari, but most came from other species. 847 of them were human. The humans had arrived 2 generations ago, brought in as cheap labor when the colony first opened. They worked the deep tunnels where the air was bad and the rock was unstable. They fixed machines that other species refused to touch. They did the dangerous jobs because the pay was good and because humans were always willing to go where others would not. Sora Okonkwo was one of those humans. She had been born on Kethris 7, daughter of miners who had come from Earth seeking better opportunities. She had worked her way up from the tunnels to a position in logistics, managing supply chains and cargo shipments. She was 43 years old, practical, and very good at solving problems. The trouble started when the seismic sensors detected something wrong. Deep beneath the colony, the moon's core was shifting. The engineers ran their calculations and delivered bad news. Within 6 months, volcanic activity would make the colony uninhabitable. The tunnels would collapse. The air recyclers would fail. Everyone needed to leave. The Velthari Consortium received this report and did what they always did. They ran the numbers. Evacuation would require ships. Ships cost money. The colony housed 12,000 workers, but most of them were contractors with limited value. The minerals they had been mining were nearly depleted anyway. The equipment was old. The buildings were aging. The accountants calculated the cost of evacuation against the cost of abandonment. They factored in insurance payments, contract settlements, and public relations expenses. They produced a final number and presented it to the board. The board looked at the number and made their decision. 3 days later, the consortium announced that Kethris 7 was being closed. All company personnel would be evacuated immediately. But company personnel only meant Velthari employees and senior management. The contractors, the workers, the families who had lived there for generations were not included. The ships came at night. They landed at the executive port and loaded quickly. Sora watched from her apartment window as the sleek vessels lifted off one by one, carrying the people who had decided that her life was not worth saving. By morning, the colony was silent. The consortium ships were gone. The communication arrays had been disabled. The supply depots had been emptied of anything valuable. 12,000 people had been left behind to die. The panic started immediately. People ran through the streets, screaming and crying. Fights broke out over food and water. Some tried to reach the landing pads, hoping that more ships would come. Others simply gave up, sitting in the dust and waiting for the end. Sora did not panic. She stood very still for a long moment, watching the chaos around her. Then she began to walk. She walked to the central plaza where a crowd had gathered. People were shouting at each other, blaming each other, demanding answers that no one had. Sora climbed onto a transport crate and waited until they noticed her. When the crowd finally went quiet, she spoke in a calm, clear voice. "The consortium has decided that we are worthless," she said. "They calculated the cost of saving us and decided it was too high. They looked at our lives and saw only numbers on a spreadsheet. They left us here to die because dying cost them nothing." The crowd stared at her. Some were crying. Others looked angry. All of them were afraid. But they made a mistake, Sora continued. They forgot what happens when you tell humans that their lives have no value. They forgot that we do not accept such calculations. They forgot that when someone tries to throw us away, we do not go quietly. She looked out at the faces before her. Human faces, Veltri faces, faces of a dozen other species. All of them abandoned. All of them declared worthless. The consortium thinks we are dead already, she said. Let us show them how wrong they are. Let us survive. And then let us make them pay for every life they tried to discard. The crowd was silent for a moment. Then someone cheered, then someone else. Within minutes, the plaza was full of voices shouting agreement, full of people who had been terrified moments ago. Now standing tall with purpose, SOR stepped down from the crate and began organizing. She found the engineers and put them to work stabilizing life support. She found the doctors and set up medical stations. She found the miners and sent them to assess the tunnels for safe shelter. Within 6 hours, the colony had stopped panicking. Within 12 hours, they had a plan. Within 48 hours, they had something more valuable than hope. They had anger. Cold, patient, calculating anger. The Veltri had treated them like numbers. Now the humans would show them what happened when numbers fought back. 6 months passed on Kethra 7. The volcanic activity grew worse, just as the engineers had predicted. Tunnels collapsed. The ground shook with increasing frequency. Toxic gases seeped up from below. But the colony survived. SOR had divided the workers into teams, each with a specific purpose. The engineers kept the air clean and the power running. The miners reinforced the tunnels and dug new shelters in stable rock. The doctors treated injuries and rationed medicine. Everyone worked and everyone contributed because there was no other choice. They lost people along the way. A tunnel collapse killed 30 workers in the first month. A reactor malfunction took another dozen in the third. Each death was mourned, remembered, and recorded. Sora kept a list of names, written by hand on paper salvaged from the administrative offices. She added to it every time someone died, and she promised each name that their death would not be forgotten. By the 6th month, they had stabilized. The population had dropped to just under 11,000, but the colony was holding. They had food from the hydroponic farms. They had water from the recyclers. They had shelter in the deepest tunnels, far from the volcanic activity. And they had a plan. SOR understood the Veltri better than most. She had spent 20 years working in their systems, learning their language, studying their laws. She knew that the consortium was built on contracts and debt, on legal frameworks that spanned 1,000 worlds. She knew that they believed in the absolute power of economics and the idea that everything could be reduced to transactions. So she decided to use their own weapons against them. The colony had no ships, but they still had communication equipment that the humans had repaired. They could not reach rescue vessels, but they could reach lawyers. SOR sent out a message to every legal firm that had ever sued the consortium. She contacted every competitor who had been crushed by Veltri business practices. She reached out to labor unions, advocacy groups, and investigative journalists across the galaxy. Her message was simple. The Veltri consortium had abandoned 12,000 workers to die, and she had proof. The response was overwhelming. Within weeks, the Kethris Reclamation Collective was born. It was a legal entity, properly registered under galactic trade law, with the surviving workers as its shareholders. Every person on Kethra 7, regardless of species, was given an equal stake. They owned nothing except their grievances, but in the Veltri system, grievances could be converted into claims. The lawyers went to work. They filed breach of contract suits for every worker who had been promised safe passage. They filed negligence, claims for every safety violation the colony had documented over the years. They filed wrongful death suits for every name on Sora's list. The amounts were staggering. When calculated according to consortium standards, the damages totaled more than the entire colony had ever been worth as a mining operation. The Veltri had made their own bed by creating laws that protected corporate interests. Now those same laws were being used to attack them, but Sora knew that legal action alone would not be enough. The consortium had lawyers too, thousands of them, and they could delay proceedings for decades. She needed to hurt them faster, but she found allies in unexpected places. A Threshy trading guild had lost half their fleet to consortium price manipulation 20 years ago. They were happy to help. A human investment firm on Earth had been waiting for an opportunity to short consortium stock. They jumped at the chance. A collective of independent miners from the asteroid belts had been organizing against Velthary monopolies for years. They provided information and resources. Together, they launched a coordinated economic attack. The Threshy traders began spreading rumors about consortium instability. The human investors started selling consortium stock in massive quantities, driving down the price. The independent miners released documents showing years of safety violations and worker exploitation. News agencies across the galaxy picked up the stories. The consortium stock price dropped 30% in the first month. Their credit rating was downgraded twice. Banks that had once competed to lend them money now demanded higher interest rates. Business partners began looking for alternatives. And on Kethra 7, the survivors watched the numbers fall and felt something they had not felt in months. Satisfaction.sora received messages from consortium representatives offering settlements. They would pay compensation. They would send rescue ships. They would make everything right. She rejected every offer. They want to buy their way out of this, she told her people. They want to pay us to go away and be quiet. But we are not for sale. We never were. That was their mistake, and we will make them understand it. The economic war continued. The consortium tried to fight back, hiring their own public relations teams and launching counter-campaigns. But they were facing something they had never encountered before, an enemy that did not want money. The humans wanted justice, and they were willing to destroy an empire to get it. The rescue ships finally came 8 months after the abandonment. They were not consortium vessels. They came from a coalition of independent traders, humanitarian organizations, and rival corporations who saw an opportunity to embarrass the Velthary. The evacuation took 3 weeks, moving everyone to temporary housing on nearby stations and colonies. Sora was the last to leave. She stood at the landing pad as the final transport prepared for departure, looking back at the colony that had been her home for 43 years. The buildings were crumbling now, damaged by months of seismic activity. Soon the volcanoes would claim everything, but the people had survived. That was what mattered. On the station, the survivors regrouped and continued their work. The legal cases moved forward. The economic pressure continued. And something new began. Testimony. The Galactic Trade Commission had agreed to hear the case against the Volthra Consortium. It was the largest regulatory body in known space, responsible for enforcing the treaties and agreements that made interstellar commerce possible. They had the power to fine corporations, revoke trading licenses, and, in extreme cases, order dissolution. Sora prepared for months. She gathered documents, organized witnesses, and built a case that showed not just what had happened on Kethra 7, but what the consortium had been doing for centuries. Worker exploitation, environmental destruction, bribery, fraud. 1,000 crimes committed in the name of profit. When the day came, she walked into the commission chamber wearing simple clothes, the same kind she had worn in the mines. The consortium sent a team of 50 lawyers in expensive suits. They brought data presentations and legal arguments and expert witnesses. They were confident that their resources would overwhelm any opposition. Sora brought something different. She brought stories. She started with the children. 1,200 children had been on Kethra 7 when the consortium left. She showed pictures of them, names and faces, not statistics. She told the commission about a young Velthari girl who had asked her mother why the ships were leaving without them. The mother had not known what to say. She told them about the elderly workers who had given their food rations to others, choosing to go hungry so that younger people could stay strong. She told them about the engineers who had worked until they collapsed, keeping the machines running through sheer determination. She told them about the doctor who had died performing surgery during an earthquake, refusing to leave her patient even as the ceiling came down. The consortium lawyers objected. They said the testimony was emotional manipulation, not relevant legal argument. The commission overruled them. SOR continued. She talked about the calculations the consortium had made, the spreadsheets that had determined human lives were worth less than shipping costs. She showed the internal memos obtained through discovery, where executives had debated whether to announce the abandonment or simply leave quietly. They had chosen silence because it was cheaper. The consortium believes that everything has a price, she said. They believe that life itself can be reduced to numbers on a balance sheet. And by their own calculations, our lives were worthless. She paused, letting the words settle over the chamber. But they forgot something. They forgot that humans do not accept being worthless. We refuse. We look at their calculations and we reject them. Not because we believe our lives have infinite value, but because we believe that some things cannot be calculated at all. She turned to face the consortium lawyers directly. You made a business decision to let us die. You treated murder as a line item. And now you sit here in your expensive suits, hoping that your money and your lawyers will make this go away. But it will not go away. We will not let it. The chamber was silent. Even the consortium lawyers had stopped objecting. SOR, they finished with the names. She read every name on her list, all 473 people who had died on Kethra 7 after the abandonment. It took almost 2 hours. She did not rush. She gave each name its own moment, its own acknowledgement. When she was done, she looked at the commission members. These are the people your calculations killed, she said. Remember them, because we will never forget. The commission deliberated for 3 days. When they returned their verdict, it was unanimous. The Velthari consortium was found guilty of criminal negligence resulting in death, breach of contract, fraud, and violations of 17 different interstellar labor treaties. The fines totaled more than the corporation's entire liquid assets. Their trading licenses were suspended pending restructuring. And most importantly, they were ordered to establish a compensation fund for the survivors and the families of the dead. It was the largest penalty ever imposed on a corporation in galactic history. And it was only the beginning. The Velthari consortium did not survive the judgment. Within 18 months of the commission's ruling, they had been forced to sell off assets to pay their fines. Their stock price collapsed entirely. Banks called in their loans. Partners abandoned them. The empire that had dominated galactic commerce for 3,000 years crumbled into dust. The Kethris Reclamation Collective, meanwhile, grew. With the compensation funds and the assets they had acquired through their economic campaign, they became a significant economic power in their own right. Sora was named CEO, though she insisted on keeping the title director, the same title she had held on KETHR as -7. Her first official act was establishing the Alcanco Accords. Named after her parents, the miners who had brought their family to the stars seeking a better life. The Accords were a comprehensive set of labor protections that applied to all workers in signatory territories. They required evacuation plans for all colonies. They mandated minimum safety standards. They made the abandonment of workers a criminal offense punishable by corporate dissolution. The Accords spread quickly. Species that had suffered under consortium exploitation were eager to adopt them. Within 5 years, They covered more than 60% of known space. Companies that refused to sign found themselves locked out of major markets. The collective itself became a model for a different kind of business. Workers owned shares. Profits were distributed fairly. Safety was prioritized over cost savings. It was not charity or idealism. Sora had learned from the consortium that business was a kind of warfare, and she intended to win. But she refused to win by sacrificing the people who worked for her. Other species watched the humans with a mixture of admiration and fear. The Velthari had been the dominant economic power for millennia, and humans had dismantled them in less than 2 years. Not through military force, not through superior technology, through pure calculated, relentless economic aggression. A Velthari historian named Koroth Ven spent years studying what had happened. He interviewed survivors, examined documents, and tried to understand how his people had been defeated so completely. His conclusion, published in a widely read analysis, became famous across the galaxy. The Velthari made 2 critical errors, he wrote. First, we assumed that economics was purely rational, that all beings would respond to incentives in predictable ways. We did not account for human irrationality, their willingness to sacrifice personal gain for abstract concepts like justice or revenge. Second, and more importantly, we underestimated what happens when humans take something personally. Other species, when wronged, seek compensation. They want to be made whole. Humans want something different. They want the entity that wronged them to suffer. They want to send a message. They want to ensure that it never happens again. We calculated that abandoning Kethra 7 was the rational choice. We were correct. It was rational. But humans do not respond to rationality when they feel they have been treated as worthless. They respond with fury. And human fury is not a force that can be calculated or controlled. Sora read Koroth Ven's analysis and found it mostly accurate. But she thought he had missed something important. She retired 5 years after the consortium's dissolution. She was 60 years old, tired, and ready to rest. She distributed her shares in the collective among the workers, keeping nothing for herself except a small pension. She moved to a quiet colony on the edge of human space, where she could watch the stars and tend a small garden. On her last day as director, a young Velthari woman came to see her. She was an intern at the collective, one of many Velthari who had joined after their own corporations collapsed. She was nervous but determined. "Director Okonkwo," she said, "I have to ask you something. Why did you fight so hard? You could have taken the settlement offers. You could have moved on. Why did you spend years destroying the consortium?" Sora looked at her for a long moment. The young woman reminded her of herself in some ways. Ambitious, practical, trying to understand a universe that did not always make sense. "Because they told me I was worthless," Sora said finally. "They looked at my life and the lives of everyone I cared about, and they decided we were not worth saving. Do you understand what that means? Not that we were too expensive to save. That we had no value at all." She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the stars. "Humans have a saying," she continued. "We call it taking things personally. It means that we do not separate ourselves from our grievances. When someone wrongs us, it is not just a transaction to be settled. It is an attack on who we are, and we respond accordingly." The consortium thought they were making a business decision. They were wrong. They were making an enemy, and humans are very good at being enemies. The young Velthari nodded slowly. She was beginning to understand. "One more thing," Sora said. "Remember that we did not do this alone. Humans started the fight, but we won because others joined us. The Threshi, the independent miners, even some Velthari who saw what their leaders had become. We built something together." She turned back to face the young woman. "That is what the consortium never understood. They saw the universe as a competition where everyone was fighting for themselves. But humans know that sometimes you fight for others. Sometimes you fight because it is right, not because it is profitable. And when you fight for the right reasons, you find allies everywhere. The motto of the Kethris Reclamation Collective was carved on a plaque in the main hall of their headquarters. Sora had written it herself in the early days when they were still fighting for survival. It read, "We remember what you calculated we were worth. Now we will show you what you owe." Years later, when historians wrote about the fall of the Velthari Consortium and the rise of human influence in galactic commerce, they would point to that motto as the perfect summary of what had happened. The Consortium had tried to reduce human lives to numbers. The humans had responded by making the Consortium pay a price that could never be calculated and across the galaxy. Other powers learned the lesson. They learned that humans could be partners, allies, even friends. But they should never, under any circumstances, be written off as worthless, because humans took that personally. And when humans took things personally, empires fell.